We are on the line 157-337. We are running on line north and south. The words hang in the air, a ghost on the airwaves. It is July 2nd, 1937. The voice belongs to the most famous woman in the world, Amelia Earhart. She is somewhere over the vast, unforgiving blue of the Central Pacific Ocean, flying towards a destination she will never reach. After this transmission, and one more garbled attempt, there would be only silence. A silence that has lasted for nearly a century. A silence that has spawned 1,000 questions. How could a pilot this skilled, in a plane this advanced, simply vanish from the face of the earth? To understand the mystery of how she was lost, we must first understand the legend of who she was. Before she was a mystery, Amelia Earhart was an icon. She was the unflappable, adventurous face of modern aviation, a symbol of female empowerment in an era when women's roles were rigidly defined. Born in Atchison, Kansas in 1897, she was a restless spirit from the start, a young woman who preferred climbing trees and exploring to more traditional pursuits. Her life changed forever at an air show in Toronto. As she watched a stunt pilot perform, he dove his plane directly at her and a friend. While her friend ran, Amelia stood her ground. She would later say that the experience was a revelation. I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. That little red plane sparked a fire. She took on odd jobs, from truck driver to photographer, to save the $1,000 needed for flying lessons. Soon after, she bought her own plane, a bright yellow biplane she called the Canary, and began to make a name for herself in the burgeoning aviation community. But it was in 1928 that her life would be permanently launched into the stratosphere of fame. She was selected to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. The catch? She would be a passenger. The flight was a success, and upon their return, the crew was met with a ticker-tape parade. The two male pilots were largely ignored. All eyes were on Amelia. Earhart, with her striking resemblance to the beloved aviator Charles Lindbergh, was nicknamed Lady Lindy by the press. She became an overnight sensation. However, the nature of her fame gnawed at her. She famously referred to herself on that flight as a sack of potatoes, a piece of luggage in a seat she hadn't flown. She was a celebrity, but she knew she hadn't yet truly earned the title of aviator in the way she wanted. The world saw a hero, but she saw unfinished business. This quiet determination would come to define the next and most crucial phase of her career. On May 20th, 1932, exactly 5 years after Lindbergh's historic solo flight, Amelia Earhart took off from Newfoundland, Canada, alone. She piloted her crimson Lockheed Vega through treacherous weather, battling ice on her wings and a cracked engine manifold that spewed flames from the cowling. After nearly 15 hours, she didn't land in Paris as planned, but in a farmer's pasture in Northern Ireland. It didn't matter. She had done it. She was the first woman, and only the second person in history, to fly solo across the Atlantic. This flight cemented her legend. There was no longer any doubt. She was not Lady Lindy. She was Amelia Earhart, a master pilot in her own right. She became a global phenomenon, a tireless advocate for women's rights and commercial aviation. She launched a fashion line, gave lectures across the country, and became an inspiration to millions. But for a spirit like hers, there was always one more horizon to cross. By 1936, there remained one last great aviation frontier, one final monumental challenge, to circumnavigate the entire globe at its equator. This, she decided, would be her final crowning achievement, the flight to end all flights. The world held its breath, ready to watch her conquer the planet. They had no idea they were about to watch her vanish from it forever. The 1937 world flight was not Amelia's first attempt at the globe. An earlier effort in March of that year had ended in disaster. On takeoff from Hawaii for the second major leg of the journey, a tire blew, and she lost control of the plane. The landing gear collapsed, a wing dug into the runway, and the magnificent aircraft was severely damaged. It was a humiliating and costly setback, but Amelia's resolve was unshaken. After extensive repairs, she was ready to try again. This time, however, she would reverse the direction of the flight, traveling from west to east to take advantage of more favorable weather patterns. This change meant the most dangerous and demanding leg of the entire journey, the vast crossing of the Central Pacific, would now come near the end of the trip. Her chariot for this monumental undertaking was a state-of-the-art, twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E. It was one of the most advanced civilian aircraft of its day, a gleaming silver bullet of metal and rivets. For the world flight, it was transformed into a flying fuel tank. The passenger cabin was almost entirely removed and replaced with massive fuel reserves, giving the Electra the theoretical range it needed to cross the planet's widest oceans. But this also made the plane notoriously difficult to fly when fully laden, a delicate balancing act of power and weight. To assist her, Amelia enlisted Fred Noonan, a man widely considered to be one of the best aerial navigators in the world. Noonan was a former ship's navigator who had recently made his name charting the trans-Pacific Clipper routes for Pan American Airways. He was a master of celestial navigation, the complex art of finding one's position by the sun and stars. But Noonan also carried a troubled reputation. His struggles with alcohol were known within the aviation community, and while there is no direct evidence he was drinking on the final flight, it remains a lingering, unsettling question mark in the story. Together, they had already traveled over 22,000 miles. They had crossed the Americas, the South Atlantic, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Now, in Lae, New Guinea, only 7,000 miles remained, but these were the most treacherous miles of all. Their next leg was the stuff of a pilot's nightmare, a 2,556-mile flight over open, featureless ocean to a target of infinitesimal size. Howland Island. Howland Island is not just small, it is almost impossibly so. A flat sliver of coral and sand, a mere 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide, rising only a few feet above the waves. It is a speck of dust in the world's largest ocean. Finding it after more than 18 hours of flying would be the ultimate test of Noonan's skill and Earhart's piloting. The plan was a careful marriage of old and new technology. For most of the journey, Noonan would use the sun to track their position. As they neared Howland, the plan was to switch to radio navigation. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Itasca, was stationed at the island, tasked with providing weather information and, most critically, broadcasting a radio homing signal that the Electra could follow. But the plan had flaws, woven from a series of seemingly small but critical compromises. The Electra was equipped with modern radio equipment, but Earhart, ever conscious of weight, had made the fateful decision to remove the trailing wire antenna necessary for transmitting on the lower 500 kilocycle frequency the Itasca was best equipped to track. Furthermore, there was a fundamental misunderstanding about communication schedules and which frequencies would be used for voice versus Morse code. The stage was set for confusion, a technological gap between the plane in the sky and the ship on the sea. On the morning of July 2, 1937, under an overcast sky, the heavily laden Electra lumbered down the runway at Lae. It used every foot of the strip, its engines roaring at full power to lift the immense weight of its fuel. Finally, it climbed into the air, cleared the trees at the end of the runway, and turned east, out over the Solomon Sea. On board, Earhart and Noonan were bound for their tiny destination, armed with their skill, their courage, and a plan they prayed was good enough. After lifting off from Lae, the Lockheed Electra disappeared into the vast Pacific sky. For hours, there was only a planned and expected silence. The flight plan called for Earhart to make radio checks on the hour, but the hours ticked by with no word. On board the Coast Guard cutter, Itasca, stationed at Howland Island, the mood was one of anxious anticipation. The ship's radio room was the designated lifeline, the final link in a chain stretching 22,000 miles around the world. The operators strained to hear a signal, any signal, through the endless crackle of atmospheric static. The silence was finally broken at 2:45 a.m., local ship time. A faint voice, unmistakably Amelia's, crackled through their receivers. "Cloudy and overcast," she reported. The operators on the Itasca sprang into action. acknowledging her transmission and asking for a signal so they could take a directional bearing. They received no reply. A few more times her voice materialized out of the ether, reporting her status, but every attempt by the Itasca to communicate back was met with silence. A terrifying reality began to dawn on the ship's crew. They were experiencing a one-way conversation. Earhart could transmit, but she apparently could not hear them. The complex radio system, with its mismatched frequencies and modified equipment, was failing at the most critical moment imaginable. As the sun began to rise over the Pacific, the situation grew more desperate. At 6:14 a.m., Earhart's voice came through again, stronger this time. She reported being about 200 miles out. Hope surged through the Itasca. The ship's captain ordered the boilers to make black smoke, creating a thick column of soot in the sky, a crude visual beacon against the gray overcast. The radio operators began transmitting a steady stream of Morse code signals, praying something would get through. Then, at 7:42 a.m., came the transmission that turned anxiety into alarm. The voice was clear, but edged with strain. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. But gas is running low. Have been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The message was a paradox. They were close enough to be heard clearly, yet blind to their target. The mention of low fuel was a death sentence in this part of the world. They were lost, low on fuel, and flying just above the waves, desperately scanning the horizon. The Itasca's operators begged her, broadcasting into the void, to hold her transmission key down for just 10 seconds. It was all they needed to get a definitive fix on her location. The reply never came. An hour later, at 8:43 a.m., the most famous and enigmatic message of the entire flight cut through the static. The signal was strong, the strongest they had yet received. "We are on the line 157,337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait." This was a direct quote from Fred Noonan's navigational chart. He had used the rising sun to calculate a sun line, or line of position. It didn't give them their exact location, but it told them they were somewhere along a specific line drawn across the map. The plan now was to fly up and down that line, hoping to cross paths with Howland Island. Her message was a request for the Itasca to take a bearing on that new frequency. But the message was too short. Before they could get a lock, the transmission ended. Her final words were a promise. Wait. On the Itasca, the radio room was a scene of frantic tension. They listened. The entire crew, the entire world, waited. A few moments passed, an eternity of static. A final garbled transmission was heard, too broken to be understood. And then, there was nothing. The stream of messages, which had served as a fragile thread connecting the aviators to the world, was cut. The radio fell silent. The silence was absolute, profound, and terrifying. Out in the infinite blue, the Lockheed Electra, with Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan aboard, had vanished. The silence that fell over the radio waves on July 2, 1937, was not immediately accepted as final. On board the cutter, Itasca, hope persisted against all odds. For hours, then days, the radio operators remained at their posts, listening for a voice that would not return. The ship crisscrossed the waters around Howland Island, its crew scanning the empty horizon, firing star shells into the night sky, praying for a sign. But as the fuel gauges on the Electra would have run dry, a grim reality set in. Amelia Earhart was not just out of radio contact, she was officially missing. The news stunned the world. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. government, at the direction of President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, immediately authorized a massive search and rescue operation. What followed was the largest and most expensive air and sea search in history up to that point. The full might of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific was mobilized. The battleship USS Colorado was diverted from its course in Hawaii and steamed towards the search area. Its float planes were launched to begin scouring the ocean from the air. Soon after, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, a floating city of steel and air power, departed from San Diego, its decks crowded with over 60 aircraft, all destined to join the hunt. The search area was immense, a daunting expanse of ocean covering more than 250,000 square miles. The primary search grid was centered on Earhart's last known line of position, the 157-337 Sun Line. For 16 days, sailors and airmen engaged in a grueling and monotonous task. From dawn until dusk, ships plowed through the waves in meticulous grid patterns, with lookouts posted on every deck, their eyes scanning the endless blue for any sign of wreckage. Above them, planes launched from the Lexington flew endless sorties, their pilots and observers peering down at the waves, searching for an oil slick, a piece of floating debris, a life raft, anything that could mark the final resting place of the Electra. The search focused on the Phoenix Islands, a small, uninhabited atoll group that intersected the flight's probable path. One of these islands was Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro. On July 9th, a week after the disappearance, planes launched from the USS Colorado flew over the island. The official report from that flight is one of the most tantalizing and controversial elements of the entire case. The pilots reported seeing signs of recent habitation, but they saw no one on the beaches and no wreckage. They concluded that whoever had been there was already gone or had been rescued. With no definitive signs of life or distress, and with countless thousands of square miles left to search, the planes moved on. It was a fleeting moment, a brief glance at a location that would later become the central focus of an entirely new theory. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The vast ocean offered up no secrets. Not a single trace of the Electra or its two pilots was ever found. On July 19, 1937, after 16 days of tireless effort and an expenditure of over $4 million, an astronomical sum at the time, the official search was called off. The Navy's official verdict was stark and somber. Earhart and Noonan, having run out of fuel, were presumed to have crashed into the Pacific Ocean and sunk in its deep, unsearchable waters. They and their aircraft were declared lost at sea. The case was officially closed. The world was left with a gaping void, a story without an ending. The largest search in history had found nothing, and in doing so, had created the perfect vacuum in which speculation, mystery, and theory could thrive for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the failed search, and for decades to follow, the official explanation for the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan has been stark in its simplicity. This theory, often called the crash and sink hypothesis, requires no conspiracies, no secret missions, and no castaways. It relies on a logical, if tragic, cascade of errors and misfortune. It is the theory of Occam's razor, the belief that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. The hypothesis begins with the immense challenge of the flight itself. Fred Noonan was a master navigator, but even a master can make a small error. Over a distance of more than 2,500 miles, an error of just a single degree in his calculations would have put the Electra dozens of miles off course. The overcast skies that Earhart reported would have made Noonan's primary method of navigation, tracking the sun, incredibly difficult and prone to inaccuracy. It's entirely plausible that they arrived in the correct general vicinity of Howland Island, but were just far enough off course to miss seeing the low-lying strip of land. This navigational uncertainty was then compounded by the catastrophic radio failures. We know Earhart could not hear the signals from the Itasca. She was flying blind, unaware that the ship was broadcasting a steady homing signal for her to follow. Her frantic final messages, reporting that she believed she was on them but couldn't see them, paint a picture of a pilot flying in circles or along a line, desperately searching for a target she could not see and could not be guided to. Every minute spent searching was another minute of fuel consumed. The final element in this chain of events is fuel exhaustion. The Electra was packed with fuel, but it had a finite range. The flight plan was ambitious and left little room for error, headwinds, or extended search time. In her last confirmed message, Earhart herself stated that gas is running low. The crash and sink theory posits that this was the final, fatal problem. Lost, unable to find their destination, and with their engines sputtering to a stop, Earhart would have had only one option: to ditch the aircraft in the ocean. A water landing in a Lockheed Electra would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The plane had low-slung wings and two heavy engines, making it inherently unstable on the water. The most likely scenario is that upon hitting the waves, a wing would have dug in, violently cartwheeling the aircraft and causing it to break apart on impact. The heavy engines and fuselage would have flooded with water and sunk rapidly, likely in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. In such a violent and sudden crash, the chances of Earhart and Noonan surviving the initial impact, let alone having the time and presence of mind to deploy their life raft, would have been slim to none. This theory also provides a straightforward explanation for why the largest search in history found nothing. If the plane broke up and sank quickly, there would be no large wreckage field to find. Any small, light debris, like seat cushions or personal items, would have been scattered by ocean currents over hundreds of square miles before the first search ships even arrived on the scene. The fuel, already nearly gone, would not have created a large, lasting oil slick. Finding a needle in a haystack is an understatement. This would have been like finding a single grain of sand scattered across a desert. It's a tragic, unglamorous, and deeply unsatisfying end to the story. But for many researchers and for the U.S. government, it remains the most logical and probable fate of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, pioneers who simply flew too close to the edge and were swallowed by the vast, indifferent ocean. The official story of a tragic crash and a rapid sinking provides a neat if unsatisfying conclusion. But another theory, one born from faint radio signals and forgotten files, paints a far different picture. This is not a story of a final, fatal plunge into the abyss, but a harrowing tale of survival against impossible odds. This is the Castaway Hypothesis, and its location is a tiny, uninhabited coral atoll, then known as Gardner Island. Today called Nikumaroro, Gardner Island is a remote ring of coral and sand, 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. Critically, it lies almost directly on the 157-337 sunline that Earhart reported flying in her final transmission. The theory posits that when Earhart realized she had missed Howland Island and was critically low on fuel, she and Noonan began a desperate search. Spotting the reef and calm lagoon of Gardner Island, she made a decision. Instead of ditching in the open ocean, she used her last moments of fuel and her phenomenal skill as a pilot to make a wheels-up landing on the island's flat, hard coral reef during low tide. The Electra, though likely damaged, was now on solid ground. They were alive. They were castaways. The first and most compelling evidence for this theory came not from the sea, but through the air. In the days and nights following the disappearance, dozens of credible radio operators across the Pacific, and even as far away as the United States, reported hearing faint, desperate distress calls on shortwave frequencies. A teenager in Iowa named Betty Klenk kept a detailed notebook of the partial messages she heard, which she believed were from Earhart. Other listeners in Wyoming and Texas reported similar signals. The messages were garbled and weak, but they told a story of distress, mentioning injuries and a need for help. Proponents of this theory believe that Earhart and Noonan could only send these signals when the tide was low, allowing them to run one of the Electra's engines to power the radio without flooding it. This explains why the signals were sporadic and often heard at night. It also explains something that the crash and sink theory cannot: the existence of any post-loss signals at all. For years, these radio signals were the only evidence. But in 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher made a startling discovery on the island. In a remote corner, he found what appeared to be the site of a castaway's camp. There were remnants of a fire, turtle bones and bird bones, suggesting someone had been cooking and eating there. Nearby, he found a partial human skeleton, a woman's shoe, and an old-fashioned sextant box used for navigation. Gallagher, believing he had found the remains of Amelia Earhart, sent the bones to Fiji for analysis. There, a doctor named D.H. Hoodless examined the bones and concluded they belonged to a short, stocky European or mixed-race male. With that, the bones were misplaced and eventually lost forever. For 60 years, that was the end of the story. But in 1998, Researchers with the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGAR, unearthed Dr. Hoodless's original, detailed measurements of the lost bones. They submitted these measurements to modern forensic anthropologists. Their conclusion was a bombshell. They found that Hoodless's 1940 analysis was flawed, and that the skeletal remains were, in their words, consistent with a female of Earhart's height and ethnic origin. The castaway was very likely a woman. TIGAR has since launched over a dozen expeditions to Nikumaroro, slowly and meticulously building a case from the island's soil. They have found artifacts from the 1930s consistent with items Amelia and Noonan would have carried. The fragments of a glass jar that perfectly match a popular brand of anti-freckle cream from the era, a product Amelia, who disliked her freckles, was known to use. They found a zipper from a flight jacket, a small pocket knife, and most tantalizingly, a sheet of aluminum aircraft wreckage that matches the exact dimensions and rivet patterns of a custom patch installed on Earhart's Electra during a repair stop in Miami. This body of evidence reframes the entire story. Suddenly, the Navy pilot's 1937 report of signs of recent habitation on Gardner Island is no longer a dismissive detail. It's a tragic missed opportunity. They likely saw the castaways' camp, but not recognizing it as a distress situation, they flew on. The Castaway Hypothesis presents a heroic, but ultimately tragic narrative. A masterful emergency landing followed by a desperate struggle for survival. It's a story of two of the world's most famous explorers, marooned on a desolate island, sending radio calls no one would act upon, and ultimately succumbing to the elements, leaving behind only faint clues that would not be pieced together for another half a century. Beyond the realms of tragic accident and heroic survival lies a third possibility, a theory that shifts the narrative from a story of exploration to one of international espionage, cover-ups, and war. This is the Japanese capture hypothesis. It is the most sensational and controversial of the theories, and it proposes that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan did not vanish into the ocean or succumb on a deserted island. Instead, it argues they fell into the hands of the Japanese Empire. The core premise of this theory is that Earhart and Noonan, either by accident or by design, flew into the Marshall Islands, a vast chain of atolls that was then under strict Japanese military control. Proponents suggest their world flight was a cover for a secret reconnaissance mission, sanctioned by the Roosevelt administration. In the tense years leading up to World War II, the United States was deeply concerned about Japan's illegal militarization of its mandated Pacific territories. The theory argues that the Electra was equipped with spy cameras, and that Earhart's mission was to overfly key Japanese strongholds, gathering intelligence under the guise of a record-setting flight. In this version of events, getting lost was part of the plan, providing the excuse needed to stray into forbidden airspace. Having either crashed or landed in the Marshall Islands, Earhart and Noonan were then captured by the Japanese military and taken to a prison on the island of Saipan, which was a major administrative and military hub for Japan in the Pacific. There they were held as spies. This theory relies almost entirely on anecdotal evidence and eyewitness accounts that have surfaced in the decades since the war. Various Marshall Islanders have claimed to have seen a plane crash around that time, and to have witnessed two white survivors, a man and a woman, being taken away on a Japanese ship. Other stories told by former U.S. servicemen stationed on Saipan after its capture in 1944 speak of local residents telling them that two American flyers had been executed and buried there. For decades, these stories remained on the fringes, tantalizing but impossible to prove. The theory gained significant mainstream attention in 2017 with a television documentary that unveiled what it claimed was a smoking gun photograph. The photo, discovered in the U.S. National Archives, depicted a group of people on a dock in the Marshall Islands. On the far right of the photo, a figure with their back to the camera looked vaguely like Fred Noonan, while a person sitting on the dock bore a resemblance to Amelia Earhart. In the background, a Japanese ship appeared to be towing a barge carrying the wreckage of a plane that looked similar to the Electra. For a brief moment, it seemed the mystery had been solved. However, The explosive claim fell apart under scrutiny with astonishing speed. Within days of the documentary airing, a Japanese military history blogger found the exact same photograph in a Japanese-language travel book that had been published in 1935. The photograph was taken a full 2 years before Earhart and Noonan ever disappeared. It could not possibly be them. The swift and decisive debunking of this key piece of evidence was a major blow to the credibility of the capture hypothesis. Without the photograph, the theory once again rests on a foundation of unverifiable, decades-old stories. While compelling and cinematic, the narrative of spies and prisoners of war is not supported by any concrete physical evidence. No wreckage of the Electra has ever been found in the Marshall Islands. No official documents from Japan or the United States have ever surfaced to support the claim of a spy mission or a cover-up. While it remains a popular and enduring part of the Earhart legend, for most serious investigators, the Japanese capture hypothesis is a fascinating story, but one that exists in the realm of conspiracy rather than credible history. Nearly a century has passed since the Lockheed Electra fell silent. The world has changed in ways Amelia Earhart could have never imagined, yet her story remains frozen in time, an enduring testament to the power of an unsolved mystery. Despite the decades of research, the competing theories and the passionate arguments of their proponents, the official status of the case remains unchanged. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan are lost, presumed dead, their final resting place unknown. But the search never truly ended. It simply transformed. What began as a desperate rescue mission by the U.S. Navy has evolved into a private obsession for a new generation of explorers, armed with technology that the original search parties could only have dreamed of. Deep-sea submersibles, advanced side-scan sonar, and autonomous underwater vehicles have all been deployed to scan the abyssal depths around Howland Island and the treacherous reefs of Nikumaroro. In 2019, Dr. Robert Ballard, the renowned oceanographer who discovered the wreck of the Titanic, led a high-profile expedition to Nikumaroro, bringing global attention to the Castaway Hypothesis. And yet, even his state-of-the-art equipment found no definitive trace of the Electra. The ocean, it seems, holds its secrets close. We are left then with 3 divergent paths, 3 possible endings to Amelia's final flight. The first is the simple, logical tragedy of the crash and sink hypothesis, a story of human limits and bad luck, where 2 pioneers were simply swallowed by the vastness of the Pacific. The second is the Castaway Hypothesis, a dramatic tale of survival supported by a compelling, if circumstantial, chain of archaeological and forensic evidence found on the shores of Nikumaroro. And the third is the Japanese capture hypothesis, a dark conspiracy of espionage and cover-ups, fueled by hearsay and enduring suspicion. Ultimately, the reason the mystery of Amelia Earhart endures so powerfully is because of who she was. She was not just a pilot, she was a symbol. She represented the boundless potential of the 20th century, a fearless spirit who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, especially for women. Her fame was built on defying limits, which makes her sudden and absolute disappearance all the more profound. It's a story with a captivating first act and a riveting second. But the final pages were torn out, leaving a void that we have tried to fill ever since. The file on Amelia Earhart remains open. Was she the victim of a simple, tragic accident? A resourceful castaway who fought for survival to the very end? Or a pawn in a secret conflict, silenced before her story could be told? Her final destination is a secret the Pacific has yet to reveal. If you want to explore more of history's greatest unsolved cases, subscribe to the Archivist and click the bell so you never miss a file.